Hey guys, just want to put in a little thing about drivetrain loss. Obviously, I have no idea how far your conversation has gone and why it's so hectic as it is. So I'm going to explain a little bit of the losses, and I'm going to explain the differences I've seen in automatics versus manuals in the cars. Now, this is in the Subarus. I can't really give you enough of a basis for any other vehicle because when it comes to Chevys, I've tuned a lot of Chevys, but I haven't had a lot of Chevys with the exact same build or anything, or mods, or even bone stock form. So I couldn't ever, provide you with enough data to make any good quality assumptions or anything. But with Subarus, I've literally tuned thousands, and I've seen everything from bone stock to extremely modified. And if we were to use the WRX as an example, or the STI. First, start with a bug eye. A bug eye, I usually see 10 to 15 less wheel horsepower on an automatic versus the manual in stock form, bone stock form. And if you take that 10 to 15 and you divide it into the horsepower output, you're going to get a percentage. And the horsepower output, they say, is 227, right? I think that's what they claim it is. So we'll just say 12.5 between 10 and 15 for the sake of argument, and 227 gives us about 5.5%. And earlier I calculated that it was closer to 4%. So if you think that 37.5 is, or 40, if it's an automatic, that means really you're getting like 36, 5% less for a manual, and that's just too high. That doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah, there's some pretty inefficient automatics, but automatics aren't quite as inefficient as a lot of people think. Obviously, the torque converter lockup that has been implemented, since the late 90s, it helps a lot with reduction in losses because there's less slip in the converter and all that crap. But let's talk about drivetrain loss a little bit. So I already mentioned slip in the converter. That is a source of losses, and that's why they lock them up on the highway to help with economy. They also use it in when you're cruising in lower gears as well to minimize slip and to provide some engine braking, which you don't normally get with automatics. But it's something that's really hard to quantify because you have to have an engine dyno and a wheel dyno with the same calibration. And that's really difficult, especially for guys like us, because we don't have the engine dyno, to test them. I used to have one, but I don't have it anymore. To test, or even to say, okay, well, Subaru says 305. Now I'm going to put it, on my dyno and see what it puts out. Well, dynos read differently, and a lot of them, especially in the U.S., read really high compared to ones from Australia or whatever. And I find personally that the numbers that I get from dynos like the one I currently have, which is a Dyno Dynamics, I find that those numbers are more accurate when you compare them to the quarter mile times that the cars run. Obviously, driver skill has to do with all of that, but I find that the track speeds and ETs really match really well with the numbers that our machine puts out. And so with that, I could say that, well, I'm going to use mine as the standard for my drivetrain calculation. And so if I have an STI on the dyno, say a GR at 305 horsepower with the crank, as the factory claims it is, that's the key, right? We only know what they claim it's going to be, and whether it's actually doing that or not, we don't know. And then I put it on my dyno, which again, calibration, who knows, right? We can only compare it to quarter mile times. I can't strap an engine to the roller, or I can't strap 4 hubs to a single engine dyno. You can't do that, so I can't compare it before and after. You can only do the math in between. I'm sure GM has ways of doing it, but obviously I don't have that. What I see is a bone stock STI GR puts down between 215 and 225, depending on weather, on our dyno, in bone stock untouched form. So if you do a little bit of math, you say the 305, you subtract, we'll say 220, because that's in the middle of those two numbers. That gives us a difference of 85. 85 from 305 is 27.9%, so 28%. And that makes sense. That seems like a very reasonable number. And if you were going to add the 5% on that for an automatic, you're at 32-ish, right? And that makes sense. That's a good, viable number for the losses that you would get out of the car. Well, why are they so high in a Subaru versus a rear-wheel drive car? Well, anytime power changes direction, anytime energy changes direction, I got torque on the input shaft going in. In a manual transmission, it goes from the input shaft to the driven shaft to the center diff, down the pinion to a ring for the front diff, and then through two U-joints, being the DOJ, which is the inner one on the axle, and then the outer CV on the axle. And then leaving the transfer case, it goes through the actual center diff, through the transfer gears, there's another gear-to-gear interface, and then out the back through three U-joints in the drive shaft, another ring and pinion and all the bearings in the rear diff, and then two more U-joints per axle. And so Subarus have 11 U-joints, and each one has a deflection. There's a rate of deflection. Anytime you have a deflection or you have any interface, like a U-joint or a gear-to-gear or a bearing, you have losses. You have losses from windage, you have losses from fluid, you have losses, from all kinds of stuff. And then if you have a car on the dyno with bad alignment, it's going to read lower, it's going to indicate or show, more losses, but it could just be because the alignment is turning power from the engine into heat of the tires. If you use a more slippery lubricant in your gearbox than the next guy, you're going to get a higher power reading. If you have lighter wheels and tires, I say it all the time, the lighter wheels and tires make a little more horsepower because you're not accelerating that mass, you're not losing energy to kinetic energy and conservation momentum and all that stuff. So really, it's I say opinion, but based on the math and based on my experience, that the manual Subarus are right around 28%, and the Automics are right around low 30s, 32, 33%. I don't know, guys. I hope it helps you guys with your dispute, but that's really all I got to offer on that. Other than some dynos do coast down testing, which I think is kind of hooey, because all they're doing is checking for some drag, but there's other things in there at play when you're in power versus out of power. There's alignments, axles change, everything moves around when you squat the car down under acceleration. And again, alignment makes a huge difference. I have had the straps too tight, and it's been tweaking the car a little bit, and I'm like, man, the power rating is just not right. And I've popped the straps loose and realigned the car, picked up 35 wheel. So it's a really hard thing to quantify without having the exact same machine, somehow measuring the exact same stuff, and having a lot of math. But my experience tells me it's right around 28% for manual and low 30s for automatic. So good luck, guys, on Facebook. Have fun with that.